This is episode 16 of my DIY luxury home cinema build. And this time we're going to talk about the AV rack. And I'm going to give you a tour through the full rack, talk through all the components, why I've used them, how they're all connected, and what sort of performance I'm getting from them. And stay tuned for when I turn the rack around and I'll show you in depth how the cable system all works. And it went from cable hell to what it is at the moment, where everything is highly managed. The cable layout is a dream, and I've got everything so you can access to the back of the equipment. But the first thing I do is I give you a time lapse of the project, if you haven't seen some of my previous episodes, to catch you up on the whole project to date, from the moment we demolished the back of the house, all the way through to building a new basement down there, forming a room within a room, build a riser and a baffle wall, treating all the walls with insulation, lining the walls, paint, carpet, and then all the DIY projects from the acoustic treatments, smart lighting, a star ceiling, and a screen masking system. And the project was exhausting, but we're catching up now to where we're at with the AV rack. And now this one starts back on day number 5, because that's when I first bought the rack. But it wasn't until day 1581 until I was finally happy that I'd completed the rack, I could turn it back around and never touch it again. And so why did it take over 4 years to do the rack? Because having a rack was one thing, but I bought it very, very early on, and then I let it sit there for quite some time before we're actually at the stage of actually getting equipment and starting to install things. And then even once that was finished, I then had a break of about maybe even 2 years before I was willing to go back and tackle the cables and try to actually do some sort of organized cable system and have everything done really, really professionally. But now let's rewind back to the start when I've got all my planning processes. I haven't built the room, but I was already researching all the equipment that was going to go in there, because I needed to understand what was going to go into my AV equipment room, how much space did it need, was this going to be 1 rack, 2 racks, what size were they going to be? And so as part of planning that, what I did was I started listing all the equipment once I'd selected each of the components. And then I worked out how many rack units or RUs they all needed for each of their components. And then I could start forming a total to work out how big the rack needed to be. So this now is the first plan I did, where I was listing down everything from here. I worked from the bottom up. The amplifiers, the Anthem MCAs, they all needed 4 rack units, up through to having the Trinnov Altitude 16 needed 3 rack units. And then getting up to some of the core equipment like the Panasonic Blu-ray, 2 RUs, and even at that stage I was planning on putting a PlayStation into here. I didn't eventually, but that was going to be 3 RUs. And then I've got a few other smaller components, everything from cooling fans that needed 1 RU, through to things like power boards, Apple TVs, and data switches. So that's where I sort of got an idea of how many total RUs did I need. And then when I had my rack that I was able to source, I could then start looking at a layout plan for it. So the plan here is for a 38 RU unit. So that's what my rack height is. And then when I did a lot of research on how to assemble all your components into an AV rack, the best bit of advice I heard was put all the heavy stuff down the bottom and the light stuff up the top. Might seem obvious, but this is the first time I'm putting a rack together. I need all the help and advice I'm going to get. And through that whole process, I'm also working through things like, well, if I've got components that are light, but I need to access them regularly, things like Blu-ray players, I don't want to put it up too high that it's actually quite awkward to be able to then get discs in and out. So my advice is start with the heavy stuff at the bottom, but then that middle area is really a crucial area where you want to have a lot of the high use items that you're going to be able to need to either get to the control panel or to do things like manage your physical media players. So just doing something like this on a spreadsheet to me was the easiest way to do it. If you are going to make changes, you can just swap things in and out and adjust and then see what order it might fit. Now I started at the bottom, and I'm still thinking at this stage that my amplifiers are going to need a shelf under it, and therefore I've got 4 RUs for the amplifier. And because of the power of the amplifiers that I'm using, I'm also worried about heat in this unit. Plus also I want to manage the Trinnov so that we're managing heat with that. So I've actually got 3 AC Infinity Aircom T8 cooling fans. And I've just divided them up. So I've got one above one of the amplifiers, another one above the top amplifier, and another one above the Trinnov itself. So that's the way I'm going to use those fans. If I had more RUs and a taller rack, I probably would have put one above every one of the amplifiers, but I didn't have the space to manage that. And you'll notice when we go and look at the rack, this is not my final layout. This was the first plan, but when I started actually installing things, I did modify things quite a bit. So I'm thinking we're going to have the amplifiers, and then we're going to have a space for the turntable, and then we're going to move up to the Trinnov, and then above that we're going to have the Blu-ray player, and then above that the PlayStation, and then above that I'm going to just use some of that top space to have our miniDSP and anything else I needed for managing the bass shakers, as well as things like an Apple TV and a data switch, just hiding up the top because they don't need to be accessed. So that was the plan, but on the right hand side you'll notice I've got this Thor RF11 noted. I've got two of them down there. And that Thor RF11 smart card is going to be used as a power board, but with advanced circuitry for being a filter and a surge protector as well. So you'll notice I don't have a power conditioner in my rack, and I will talk about that later on in terms of why, but I'm using a filter and a surge protector based on just having some obviously expensive equipment that's going to be filtering through it. And the other thing that I found really useful was this diagram here, which is showing how to do cabling for different types of things, whether it's for speaker wire or for data and anything with power running through it for AC. And I found this really useful to understand what items you're trying to separate and by what distances. Because whilst I'd love to be able to separate the speaker wire all running down one side of the rack and all the power cords running down the other side of the rack, I've got a feeling that's not going to be possible with just the amount of equipment. And so this is going to give us some guides in terms of either trying to keep them at a certain distance away from each other, or from knowing when you're going to try to do things just at a right angle where you need to cross them over. And the other really important system diagram I've got is this one here, where I was always keeping track of knowing which channels I'm feeding through the Trinnov, what speaker they're running to, and what amplification they're running from. And this is going to be my master guide when we start connecting up and doing all the interconnects and the speaker cables, so that I'm going to be super organized with labeling cables, and I'm going to know which things feed through what amplification and what Trinnov channel. By using the Trinnov +4 feature is how I'm going to get 20 channels out of my system, but also using a miniDSP is what I'm going to do to get some more feeds into my subwoofers. So keeping track of those extra 4 channels out of the Trinnov, but also what's feeding through the miniDSP outputs is going to be important so that we don't lose track of that later on as well. Guys, if you're enjoying this build series, I'd really appreciate if you give it a like. Helps my channel enormously. And subscribe if you haven't already. I've got plenty more episodes coming up in this series, so subscribe so you don't miss out on those. And check out any of my previous episodes to see every last inch of how I've put together this cinema. I go through everything in enormous detail if you haven't already seen that already. And my aim with this series is to show you in excruciating detail of how to put together a cinema, at least from how I did mine, maybe even more detail than you've seen in any other YouTube channel before. So if you're thinking about doing a cinema yourself or upgrading the one you've got, if you can get some ideas from this, some inspiration, or maybe some things to avoid, then that'd be awesome, and I'd love to hear about it. And everything that I've used for products where I can find it, I've put a link down below to Amazon. So if that's helpful for you and your project, then check it out. Now, let's go and visit the rack. So the first thing to note is the rack measures 1.8 meters tall, 600 mil wide, and 550 mil deep. And when I got this rack, it was actually just on some metal feet. And so the room that I've got here for the AV rack, it's pretty small, and it doesn't have a whole lot of room to wiggle around and move stuff. So the rack needed to have wheels on the bottom. And so the first thing I did is I went and bought 4 industrial casters so that they could handle a massive amount of weight in this rack and be able to have some sort of maneuverability, just to sort of pivot the thing around at least. And even that was a little bit tricky because I had to make some blocks underneath it for them to have something to attach to. And even that was quite difficult because I needed to have some way of attaching these casters when the unit itself wasn't going to allow that without having another piece of blocking that I was going to add in. So I've done that, so then I could add these casters, and now I've got my unit on wheels. But the second problem was that this rack was actually kind of a gunmetal blue color when I got it. And I really needed this to be black. My whole, obviously, room in the equipment room, everything in here is painted black. So even though my room was quite advanced in the construction phase and already carpeted, I went and sprayed the rack myself whilst it was in this room and just put the plastic sheeting around everywhere so that overall it's black and it just blends in with the room. And I was really happy with the spray job that I did of that. And the other thing to look at is it's not in my rack, but I've got another amplifier tucked around here behind one of my rear subs. And that is the amplifier for my bass, and that is the amplifier for my bass shakers. So it's not in the rack because basically it wouldn't fit. And it was actually easier just to mount it here for where the cables could run directly to the bass shaker, but also the remote unit the wire could just comfortably sit without having to like somehow come out of the equipment room and have a remote. Otherwise I just attach this one straight to the wall and it's a lot more accessible like that. A couple of other simple ones. I've got some LEDs that are attached onto the rack here, and that's on a sensor. So there's a little sensor unit just down here, and basically as soon as you walk in front of this rack at all or open the door, it picks it up and turns the light on. So that's worked out really well. There's an app for it which I can change the colors. Occasionally I do, but I usually keep it on blue. And I've also got another light up the top. It's a little bit hard to see, but these are just LED magnetic. You'll also notice with my room, I do not have a front door on my rack, and I also do not have side doors or rear doors. So basically the whole thing is open, and I think that's really important to manage heat. We do not want this stuff getting hot, so I took off all of those side panels. Unfortunately, after I'd already painted two of them, because I thought at that stage I would actually keep the sides on. So I'd sprayed all those. They were looking good, but they are now useless because we want to manage heat and we want to have that whole thing with airflow flowing and not being inhibited by metal panels on the side. But let's also start with just the door itself to the room, because one of the things we're trying to do to manage heat is we've got fans on the top and the bottom of the door. So this is all linked from an AC infinity system, and we're going to be drawing in cool air from the intake at the bottom, and we'll be exhausting hot air through the fan at the above. Each of them has a control panel, and that control panel will just monitor the temperature, and we'll have also some cutoff temperatures when the fans kick in, as well as an alarm temperature. And then the fan speeds are just, usually I keep it on fairly low. The back side has got a connection between the two because they are both linked in the middle. And it's a little bit ugly, but there's no other way to do this really, because you need to have this as your sensors, because I want the system both kicking on at the same time. So there's a connection between one of them which connects down to the other one, and then there's another connection for the probe, which is then going to come down to, I keep it at the middle of the door basically, and that probe is going to do their reading so that both probes will pick up the same temperature, and therefore the fans will kick on at the same point in time. I've just got some black conduit that's hiding over that, as well as the power that's running back through here all the way around my room before it's plugged in. And there's the power around the bottom. Again, there's no real easy way to do this. It's a little bit hard to disguise, but the power cord is just running through the side. So I'll try to capture here, just showing how narrow this room is. It's 880 mils wall to wall. And then I've got all my Blu-ray storage banked hard against one of those walls. So it's a fairly tight space. This is what I've got to work with. So starting at the bottom, and you see we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, which are the Anthem MCA 525 Gen 2 amplifiers. They're 5-channel, 225 watt powered amplifiers. Now, very, very early on in my cinema design, I was always going with separates. I was never looking to go with a combined AV receiver because I always knew I wanted more speakers than I could ever get from one of those systems. And they were going to tap out when I still wanted to get more for Atmos and for subs, etc. So I went separates all the way and 5-channel amplifiers. It takes up a good amount of space in the rack. You know, it's pretty much almost half of the rack is amplifiers. And these things are enormously heavy. I cannot understate how heavy they are. I've got them all sitting on shelves. So there's a 1RU shelf with the amplifier sitting on top of that. And then like I showed you in my layout plan, on the second one, I then sit an AC Infinity T8 cooling fan. And that's got exhaust that runs out of the back of that unit, but it draws heat from the unit below it. So question is, why did I go with the Anthems? And basically I was really just getting feedback from my dealer so that we knew we had a Trinnov system at this stage and looking at what power options we had for it. And I also knew I needed to get up to 20 channels powered. So I needed to be able to do all that in a way where the power was going to be able to handle the KRIX Wall of Sound MX40 system. And that's got some extreme power requirements. And I needed to be able to make sure I was going to be able to handle that with enough amplification. So it was actually both input from the dealer as well as from KRIX themselves, who looked at the design of my system and gave feedback to see whether or not the solution of the Anthem was going to be good enough, and they were happy with it. Now the cooling fans, you see, have got that similar sort of design as what's on my door, where you can set your temperature, have a probe setting, and they basically just come on by default. This is set to auto, so if the amps are running hot, then these things will come on. I never need to touch these ones, and I also never need to touch the Anthems to turn them on or off because they're on by trigger set by the Trinnov, and we'll show you that when we look around the back of the Trinnov. Now we're getting up to the good stuff. Here's the Trinnov, and that doesn't need a shelf. That has got its own side plates that go directly into my rack. I've got the Altitude 16, and this is the model where they had the 16 channels, but they then came out with the software that allowed the +4 feature. And I got my system pretty much just after they'd done that, and then allowed for the ability to get up to my 20-channel system that I needed. Now, I don't use cover plates or anything because really I don't have many voids that I'm trying to hide, and I really didn't need to worry about that sort of look for me. On top of the Trinnov, another AC Infinity cooling fan T8 model. I really wanted to make sure we could protect the Trinnov as much as possible. Things do run hot in this room, I'll guarantee that. Now we'll come to really what was the last thing that I actually put in my rack, and this is the turntable, and then I've also got a phono preamp by Riga, which is sitting below it in the shelf down here. Next to that is an Apple TV, 4K. I don't use that a huge amount. We actually tend to watch more just purely 4Ks and Blu-rays. Don't do a lot of streaming down here, but from time to time that does come in handy. And in this little pouch is something a little bit special. So in here I have a Samsung SSD, and what's on there are the original Star Wars movies in 4K, but it's the original as seen in the cinema, 1977, 1980, etc. versions of Star Wars in 4K from Project 77. So that's run plugged directly into my Panasonic unit. So let's look at the turntable. This is my project debut turntable. It's the first turntable I bought. It's not certainly the best one I've got. I've got my main turntable, which is a Riga upstairs. I had this left over after I moved this one down and put it on a sliding tray so you can actually then get to the top. It's just got enough space. Clearance is not more than that, but that's how much RU space I had left over. I had a telescoping shelf that I found that was suitable for this rack that would come out far enough to house the turntable and fit that. I've put a cork mat on it, and I've upgraded the needle to an Orifon blue. And you might notice there's a weird paint finish going on there. This used to be a bright red, the Ferrari red color debut, and it looked horrendous when I put it into my black room in my cinema, even though you only really see just this little stripe across the front here in red. But what I did is I pulled the turntable pretty much completely apart, and I then repainted the base, and it was a pretty horrendous paint finish. I'm not happy with it at all, but considering that this is pretty much in sort of darkness in this room most of the time, the paint finish actually doesn't matter. The fact that it's black is enormously beneficial. It's in a gloss black, but it just bubbled up too much, and it was quite hard just working with all the components because there's still some electrical stuff underneath that was still all connected, and unfortunately that just had to be good enough. Moving up from there, we've got the Panasonic DP UB9000 4K Blu-ray player. And you might notice both on here we've got a sensor, and it was on my Trinnov as well, where I've got a sensor which is going to pick up from my IR repeater, and that's where when the door is shut to the room and you're operating the controls in the room to my remote in there, the cable comes all the way back to these units, and then it will trigger those. I'm really happy with this player. The only thing I do notice is that discs come out very, very hot after you've played them. The machine just, for some reason, it runs really hot, and the discs, when you take them out, are very warm. I don't know if that's normal. The player has always worked super well, but the discs just come out hot. Then I've got the model down from this upstairs as well, and discs don't come out from that hot at all. Moving up is the Yamaha PX10 model amplifier, and this runs my MX40 front subs. So the two front subs behind the screen are powered from this unit here. And why this and not just the Anthem? And that's quite simple, because the advice from KRIX was that the Anthems may struggle at the extreme end in powering the MX40 subs. And we're talking about the extreme ends here, but they need a lot of power. And this has got 1,000 watts in this on 2 channels. So that is running the front subs, 1,000 watts. Above that, I've got some Cambridge Audio DacMagic 200Ms. There's 2 of those, and this is because this is what the Trinnov needs to run the Plus 4. You need to run it through a DAC, and when designing my system through the dealer and through KRIX, the advice through KRIX was that this was the unit to use for the best output running down from the Trinnov. So they're working directly with Trinnov as the lead supplier in Australia, and the Cambridge Audio DacMagic was what they recommended, so we go with that. As a DAC, they are not cheap, but if you're running a Trinnov system, it's kind of a you're in all-in mode. And on the shelf above that, a couple of small things. We've got a switch running at the very top here, and I've also got a hub for my sofa baton remote, which I don't actually use. or haven't set up at this stage, but I do have the hub sitting in there all connected to the system. And through the back there, you can just see some of those Thor smart guard power filters and surge protectors. And we'll see that from the other side in a sec. Now let's try to spin it around. So a quick look at the side of the rack here. Going down from the top, I've got another sensor light up here. I'm running a little tiny power board here, and that's mainly so that I can turn my miniDSP at the power on and off easily, because the actual unit is hiding behind here and I don't want it left on all the time. These are my spare, I call them wooden donuts. It's what goes in the cup holders that then holds a lolly tray. And this is their little hidey spot. And then I just have some cables wrapped around here. I've got a feed for HDMI if I ever want a spare HDMI input into the back of the Trinnov so that I can get access to that. Something like running through a laptop, I can just then roll that out from here. Now the other thing I want to show is the power here running to the wall. You see there's 4 double GPIOs, and 2 of them, these 2 here, are running off one circuit, and these 2 are running off a second circuit. And that's because when I came up with the overall system components, I worked out how much amps they were all going to be using, especially things like the Trinnov and the Anthems. And I totaled all that up and worked out that it was starting to push one circuit too hard. And then what I did was work out to try to split the load between what some of those things are plugged into. So for example, these 2 cords here are running both to the Thors. So I've got 2 Thor 11 units, which are the smart guards, and each of those run to a different circuit. And then each of those is balancing the load between different amplifiers. And that way, we're just trying to spread the load between these 2 circuits. Now, the other thing we'll have a quick peek at is just the way that all the speaker cables that are coming from the top corner of my room have all just been bunched together, and I've got looming tube around them to try to keep them organized as they just feed through down the back before making their way over into the rack itself. That was one of the last jobs I did, but in some ways probably should have been the first one, because that was just like a whole snake of just one massive pile of speaker cables before. And I'll show you one crazy thing. After I put those wheels on the bottom of the rack, and then we put the door seal around the door, the top of the rack now is the smallest bit taller than what the actual door seal is. So the rack now can't wheel out of the room without grazing it a little bit. I thought I had that so that it would still be able to wheel out of the room if I ever needed to move it around, but the wheels are just a fraction, probably one size too big. So that was a bit of a miscalculation. It kind of looks like it might go through, but I think the screws on the top is what grates it. I haven't needed to take it out of the room, and everything's now wired up, so you really couldn't. But it was the plan that you could at least wheel this forward and out of the room if you ever needed to. So here we are with the AV rack, all the back and all the cabling you can see here. It's kind of a bit of a controlled chaos situation. I've used Velcro everywhere I can to keep things organized so that I can get to it easily enough and replace stuff if I need. I've got a couple of areas where I've done some zip ties, but not that many. But for the most part, this is as good as I can get it. So for this one, we're going to start at the top this time, and there's a lot going on. It's going to be hard to even try to see what's where and what it's actually doing. But the first thing we've got really are 2 of the Thor units are running along here and running along there behind it. And the way I've done that, you can see the Thor there, I've just spaced them out separately because otherwise I was having conflicts with where the overhang from some of these big bulky power block bricks were making it not possible to then plug things into the one below it. Between there's also another shelf along here. It's almost impossible to see. There's a shelf there, and that's where I can get access back to that switch that was at the front. So the switch cabling is running back through here, And then back at this level, we've got the Yamaha PX10 amplifier. And over here, we've got the antenna for the Wi-Fi. So there's a direct cable running through from my upstairs switch. So I've got my router running through, and that provides the data that's coming through all the way to this cable here is one cable running from the switch upstairs, plugged into here, and that gives us a Wi-Fi connection downstairs in the cinema. And the reception down here with that Wi-Fi is perfect. Anywhere where I've got spare excess cable, I've just tried to loop it around as much as possible and then Velcro it in 2 different directions so that it doesn't come loose. Same way with one here. I can still get to all the terminals amongst all this if I ever need to. And then power, wherever possible, I've tried to shift power along one side, being along down here. And at one stage, I was actually zip tying power with red so I could keep track of where all the red was. But at some stage, I did start using red for other stuff as well. Through the back here is the Panasonic Blu-ray Player. So it's running through there. Now here is another power board. So this is a purely rack mounted power board because I've got so many things that need to plug in this rack. They weren't all fitting up into those 2 Thor units. So I've got another rack running here. And the sort of stuff I'm running through here are generally things relating to the turntable or other things that are not massively critical to my major power hungry amplifier and Trinnov type things. And that turntable, when it slides out on the telescope shelf, needs to be able to have enough cable so that when it's running through to the phono unit, it's not ever going to have that stretch and cause issues. Now running down from there, there's an AC infinity fan here. And then you can see the back, here's the exhaust from those cooling fans. And as much as possible, there is a way for airflow to come back through here because the cables aren't sort of too in the way. But keep in mind, this is actually still pointing towards the wall unit usually. So there's not a whole lot of air circulation in this room, unfortunately. That's one of the limitations I haven't been able to solve. I want to show you what I've got here. So we've got like a cable management bar running along here, and that's what I'm going to be using to have all of the cables running from the adapter back onto that and then running across to where it needs to go to. So I don't want cables running down along here at all. We want it getting to a cable management bar and then going either that way or that way. On this one here, I've got another different style as well, which pops out even further because I made this little shelf unit here for my miniDSP. So these are it's just a wood shelf that I've made. I drilled all the holes in the bottom, basically so that it's got airflow. I did find the miniDSP. This is the 2x4 HD version. The miniDSP does get quite warm, and the way that everything was connected up, it was always on, and it was always sitting here getting a little bit warm, and I wasn't really happy with that. So I've now plugged the power of that back around to this, which I can then turn off and on every time I'm using the cinema, but it never stays on with power running to it, and therefore this is nice and cool now. So that little shelf was just a way of keeping this so it's in position, but I didn't really have anywhere on the front area where I could put it, and I needed to find a way, but the cables are here running through to their sub locations. But now we come down to the Trinnov. This is where really everything gets really crazy because we've got everything plugged in and there's a lot of stuff going on here. So we've got, at the simplest form, we've got the projector, we've got other HDMIs, and again I've got really just the Apple TV, the Panasonic Blu-ray, and then I've got a spare one for running to a potentially a laptop. And you can see the analog outputs are just these 2 here. This is where I'm running my +4 from. So they run to, you can see my labeling here, they run to the Cambridge left and Cambridge right. So that's going to run to the front subs, for example. Everything else is running XLRs out. And as you see, I label everything of where it's going. So I've labeled both the channel, which Trinnov channel it's going to, as well as what speaker location it's going to go to. So I label everything so that it shows what channel it's plugged into. That way, if I ever need to unplug this, I can easily just put it back in very quickly. And at the same time, if you follow down to see where it's going to go to, it's going to be labeled with which Trinnov channel is plugged into the amplifier as well. So I can always identify every cable at each end where it needs to go to, both on the amplifier as well as the Trinnov. Here I've got my turntable plugged into the back of the Trinnov, and I've also got a data cable running there for network access, and that's going to allow the unit to go up into that switch above, which is also going to mean that then I can connect into the Trinnov app and manage the Trinnov through the interface. Generally, I'll either do that on a laptop or probably just on an iPad. And the other thing on the Trinnov here is the triggers. So there's a trigger out off from there, and that trigger out is then going to go through and connect into the back of the Anthem amplifier just in here. And then that daisy chains to an output trigger, which then goes down to the input trigger on the next Anthem amplifier, output all the way down. So pretty much from one Trinnov trigger, it's going to connect through into the 4 Anthem amplifiers. And that's how when the Trinnov turns on or off, it will trigger these Anthems all as a set going on or off as well. And I've never had that not work. Again, spare cable, I'm just trying to loop, keep tight. Everything's hooked back into those cable management bars. And then from there, if it's going down to a lower amplifier, I run it down along the side so that all that will run along until it then runs across the bar that it needs to get to the amplifiers. So for example, the first amplifier here, I've got the connections, and that's running to the biamped center speaker. So everything's labeled there, as well as what Trinnov channel it's input into. Everything's labeled like that across the whole thing. And then just trying to keep spare cabling wherever possible, just looped up like that. And you'll see where I do have those biamped speakers from the LCRs. That's really why I needed so many amplification channels. Again, same sort of organization of the cables all running across. Spare cabling velcroed onto the side. Speaker wire then going the other way. So I've pretty much got my interconnect cables running up through here as a general rule. And then I've got my speaker cable always running across here and then out. So all the speaker cable finds its way over into these areas with the looming tube. And then once I've got a bundle of it, that looming tube goes out back into the area where it's going to feed back behind the rack up into the ceiling. So the cabling that I'm using, this is a 12 gauge. It's a very, very high quality copper oxygen-free cable. So I do think you need to have good cabling, but it's not excessive in some ways. So there's a lot of speaker cable in a room like this. This is 12 gauge. And when I go into the interconnects, for the most part, I'm using a lot of these, which are SVS. And it's just to the length that I needed for getting to the amplifier back to the Trinnov. So there are different lengths going on in here. AC cooling rack system through there. Amplifier that sits underneath it. And then the last amp down below. So you can sort of get to stuff. It took a long time to go through and organize all these so that everything was organized in a way where if you've got excess cable, you can organize it, but otherwise you can keep everything in an organized manner. And you can get to individual cables for certain pieces of equipment if you need to. So in terms of cables, pretty much everything here is sort of decent, but not overboard. I do have a combination of things going on though, with some of it going to the subwoofers where I've used Audio Quest, and that is the Audio Quest Black Lab series. So I've got a couple of those in particular where I really wanted to have good quality and went a little bit higher end for those, going to the subs. Otherwise, there's a lot of SVS, and there's a couple of other things with... Otherwise, there's a lot of SVS cabling in here. And the other thing you'll notice, is for my speaker wire, I have got banana plugs on everything that comes into amplifiers, and they are KRIX banana plugs, and everything connecting in here is all on banana plugs. When it goes to the actual speaker terminal itself, that's just bare wire. But in here, we're all on banana plugs. And I did all the terminations of all the speaker wires in here myself. So in addition to, I guess, connecting up to the banana plugs, but anything with speaker wire where I just had to get the connections ready to the speakers themselves was just a job I sat there and did that. Was just a job where I just sat there and worked through that myself. And for the overall power running from the rack connections from the Thor unit, all coming down through the looming tube, and that then connects back up to a bunch that then finds its way back over to the circuit GPOs. This took me about 3 solid days of sitting here on a little stool doing nothing more than trying to untangle the mess of who knows how many 100 cables or so. That was just an absolute nightmare. And once I'd done that and then got all that with all the Velcro and all the looming tubes and everything organized all the way back to the source of where it came from, it was just an unbelievable feeling, because that was a horrible job. The last thing I want to show you in here though, and you've probably seen it by now, is what the hell is that on the ceiling? That is trying to get heat extracted out of the room. So after I'd used the room for the first couple of years, and you put the movie on, you shut this door, and then you open up the door at the end of the movie, this room is warm. This was really, really warm. So I wanted another way of trying to help prolong the life of all the equipment by removing more heat. Now I can't put any sort of air conditioning in here. I don't have any vents that are coming into here. So what I did, again, went back to my old AC Infinity product range, and there's a little remote on the side of the wall here. And again, it's another sensor that comes on automatically, and I've got that set to a certain temperature. That unit just sits there. I've just mounted that on the wall. It's then cabled all the way up the wall, up around that conduit, until it goes into the major unit of the motor there. So from that unit, I've got this AC Infinity ducting that goes and extracts hot air into this unit. There's a fan through there, sucking through into that vent, and then it will then extract it out through there into the wall. And you think, well, where on earth does that go? And in some ways, that was the problem, because that doesn't go anywhere until I created another hole all the way through my room back out to create a vent here into the room. So the hot air does go back out into the room, but it's better being out here than in this little room. But I had to cut a hole all the way through that distance there to make that happen. And there was about 3 layers of thing I had to cut through in order to basically put that ducting all the way through that hole. That was another one of those jobs where I didn't document it as I went through it, because it was horrific to do. And once I got started, it was so messy, into a room where I'm now cutting hole into gyprock again and trying to send a massive drill bit through a really, really long area into framing that was behind it. That was very difficult. And you notice there's like a dangly little temperature sensor into the room. That's how it operates. Now the last problem I've got here is the bottom amplifier has actually got a spare terminal. You might think, well, that's not really a problem, is it? It is, because I always keep thinking, how can I use that? I've got another amplification channel there, and I've actually got one next to it as well in there, which even though I've got cables into it, I've not got them going anywhere. That's cabled all the way through to under the front riser, but I've never actually connected it to anything. So in theory, I've got 2 unused amplification channels, and on my miniDSP, I've also got 2 outputs that are not connected to anything at the moment. So it may look like it's full, but I've got some underused capacity coming out of my miniDSP, and I just need a good idea of what to do with it. Any suggestions? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching this. Subscribe to my channel, do not miss future episodes, and throw a like on the video. It helps me a lot, really appreciate it. The next episode we're going to talk about is my speaker systems and the projector. I'm going to try to cover all of that in one episode, why I chose KRIX, and what does that speaker system all comprise of. I've got all the links to products that I've used down below in the comments. Check it out if you're building a cinema or want to know what I've used and whether you should look at it as well. And if you've got any comments, leave them down below. I'll try to get back to you. Otherwise, I'll see you on my next episode. Let's talk about my KRIX speakers. Bye.